But I think whatever way you're coming at it from, you have to learn. I was staying focused on the problem, but I also knew that there was I knew that technology was going to be part of the solution. Maybe it wasn't the top end technology, that I had started with. And I knew that I had to be realistic about the market. So I had to learn a tremendous amount. So I think that's part of it. No matter which way you approach it, you have to be ready to learn and available to learn, or you're not going to be successful.
Welcome to the In Factor, conversations with entrepreneurs who started, stumbled, and succeeded. I'm your host, Rebecca White, and I'm really glad that you joined us for today's conversation. Our guest is Dr. Cori Lathan. She's a neuroscientist, engineer, entrepreneur, board member, and a true techno-optimist. A really smart lady that's accomplished a lot. I met Cori recently at an event in New York City for women serving on boards of publicly listed companies. I was immediately drawn to her energy, her vision, and her commitment to building things that mattered, and I knew I needed to get her on the podcast. In our conversation today, Cori and I talk a lot about the companies that she's built, often at the very edge of what technology could do. Her first company, in fact, was somewhat limited by the constraints of early stage tech. And that really resonated with me because you see, a number of years ago, I also was co-founder in a startup that was tech-enabled. We had a really important mission, but the technology at the time just wasn't available to build it the way we could have built it today. Like Cori, we had to build it from the ground up. We built our software 3 times. I often call it the Goldilocks model. The first version didn't do enough. The second was way overkill, and it took the third one to get it just right. But anyway, it was challenging, but it taught me a lot about innovation, about timing, especially with technology, and about resilience, sticking with things and executing past failure. In our conversation, we talked today about how far technology has come. And like Cori, I'm a techno-optimist. I am so excited about everything that we can do today. And really with AI now, it's just amazing how we can speed up our work processes and our workflow. But it's also tempting to go down the path of following where technology is leading us instead of staying focused on the real problem we're trying to solve for our customer. My business partner and I talk about this almost every time that we have a strategy discussion because there are so many things that it seems like we can do with technology that we couldn't before. Building this company that we're now building, which is an AI-enabled business, I'm often finding myself pulled in many different directions by what the tech can do. But I'm really trying to stay focused, and I understand that it's clarity of purpose, understanding the why, that's really going to make a difference in whether or not this business works. And so with all this new technology, I think as entrepreneurs, we have to really refocus ourselves on the why of what we're doing. Albert Einstein once said, everything should be made as simple as possible, but not simpler. That quote really reminds me that in a world of rapid innovation, simplicity isn't about doing less. It's about doing what truly matters. As entrepreneurs, especially in tech, we have to stay grounded in both self-awareness and empathy. Technology can enable great things, but it's our humanity that gives those things meaning. So as you listen to the conversation today with Cori, I know you're going to love hearing her story, and you're going to be impressed by the kind of work that she's done and she continues to do using technology. It's an amazing one, and I think it's a great one for us all to reflect on what technology is allowing us to do today to help us meet our purpose in meeting our customer needs even better. But again, keeping in mind that it's our humanity and the why of what we're doing that really matters. So let's get into the conversation with Dr. Cori Lathan. Cori, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, me too. I'm really excited to get to know you better. We serendipitously met at an event in New York. We're both on public boards, and we were invited to be a part of a group called Madam Chair and Board Prospects. And I loved it. I think we reached out to each other beforehand on LinkedIn.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. And I got excited because your world parallels with mine in some ways, entrepreneurship and academics. So it's very cool to have you on the show. We also are book authors, and you've written a really, really interesting book, Inventing the Future, Stories from a Techno-Optimist. And I want to dig into that a little bit. And to get us started, what I'd love to hear is tell us a story, a brief story from that book. What's an interesting anecdote or story that you might be willing to share with our audience to kind of get us started?
Yeah, I would love to do that. Yeah, I'll start with, it's actually the first chapter in my book, and it was the story that motivated me to really start my company. And I think it really dovetails nicely with a lot of things that you say in your book about seeing a problem, seeing a need. You know, when you're young, you don't have a lot of world experiences, right? I was a young graduate just out of my PhD, a new professor of engineering, and I was working with the National Rehab Hospital on how to use technology, emerging technologies. This was in the mid-90s. We were looking at virtual reality and robotics and sensors, and we were trying to look at how technology could be used to really bring the physical rehabilitation world forward, really from a research perspective, though, from more of an academic research perspective. And I started working with kids with disabilities. And I was really inspired by these kids because they would come in and a lot of them had physical limitations, like from cerebral palsy, and they would work really hard on their, physical therapy and their parents. And so we got excited about gamifying their physical therapy. And we would hook them up to an old Nintendo set. We would make up wearable sensors, and we would hook them up to a Nintendo, and they could play Nintendo by raising their arms or, whatever their physical therapist wanted them to do. And so they would get super excited about doing their physical therapy. But when the parents came and would see what their kids were doing, they would say, well, that's great, but every day I'm making decisions whether to help them with their physical therapy or with their homework. So the parents were literally having to make choices between their kids' cognitive development and their physical development. And so as a team, we said, why can't we do both? Why can't we integrate these tools in physical therapy so that they're actually reaching their developmental goals and their cognitive goals at the same time they're doing their physical therapy? And that launched our first product, Cosmobot, which was an educational robot, which led kids through various different activities, both physically and cognitively, like leading them through a Simon Says game where they'd have to raise their arms as part of their physical therapy, but it was also part of a Simon Says, receptive language skills and multi-step processing. And so that was really the motivation for our first product.
Man, I love that. And I love that you started with the story about yourself, because of course that was going to be my next question. Like, tell us a little bit more. You've done so much, but that story is really interesting. I love that you felt called to do it. And you started that company, you said, in the 90s.
Yeah.
So technology has really advanced a lot since then. And, it's interesting because I started a company many years ago, in the early 2000s that would have benefited so much from AI and what we have today. I mean, the things that we had to do back then, because it was a technology enabled company designed to help keep campuses safe and to provide information and reduce risk.
Yeah.
Do you look back at what you built then and think about what's available now? I mean, I was just in the world of robotics. I just saw the latest one that Elon Musk came out with, and I guess things have advanced a lot since the 90s even.
Well, thank goodness for naivete and, the young naivete, because I didn't know really anything about product development. I didn't know anything. I barely knew the word entrepreneur. I didn't know what an IPO was. I think I never would have tackled it if I was being realistic. So I was idealistic. The type of robot that we created, Cosmobot, still couldn't go to market today. I mean, it's just not something, finding, and I'm sure we'll get into this, but, for me, coming as a technologist, finding that intersection of need, technology, and market, finding that like Venn diagram intersection is really difficult. And especially when you're a technologist like myself, where I'm super excited about the technology, I try not to be a technology looking for a problem, but I do look for problems that could be best served by technology to solve the problem, because those are the problems that I'm most excited about, that I'm good at creating. But that type of robot, I mean, I think, we were creating it for kids. So either the parents or the teachers would have to buy it. And it's very hard to build a high tech market around, build a market out of high tech products. And because they also don't have a long lifespan, because technology keeps changing. So it's very difficult. I'll give you another perfect example. We did a project for the military where we developed a product for the military that was essentially a headset that you could see through. So you could see your local surroundings, but you could also overlay information about where your robots were in the field or where the troops were. So it was for what's called the dismounted fighter. So someone who is patrolling, in uniform, and would wear these glasses and have information about their surroundings. Sound familiar? Augmented reality, Google Glass, all of that. We did that 15, 20 years ago, and there's still no real market. I mean, Google tried to do Google Glass, 10 years ago? And so it's really, when you're talking about high tech products, I mean, you'd think Google would know better, right? They put in all of that money and time and effort to make Google Glass, and there was no market.
Yeah.
But they pushed the industry forward.
Right, which is very important. And so, oh man, you hit on so many things that I think are spot on for entrepreneurs to hear. I love your Venn diagram example. You call yourself a techno-optimist, which I love, and I guess I am as well. And I fall into the trap all the time of getting excited about the possibilities of what can be created, more of that production perspective. And I was just having a conversation with the tech person I work with, and it was really all about this, and it has to always go back to what problem are you solving? Because as you point out, the technology will change, all the assumptions that you make at the beginning you're probably going to kill 90% of them as you learn along the way. But the process itself, I think, is such a exciting learning journey. And, it's just, it's incredible, I think. And it's, listening to you tell your story, I just have to go back and find out a little bit more about you and like where you come from, and how you got to this point. And I definitely want to pick back up on what we've been talking about, but you were an academic first. So tell us about your journey, because I too went through a PhD program, and it's not for the faint of heart. And there's a reason, I guess, that we all find ourselves there. So tell us a little bit about what got you to this point in your career as an academic and then becoming an entrepreneur.
Yeah. Well, I was always fascinated with the space program. I wanted to be an astronaut.
Oh, yeah.
I had a second grade teacher who also loved Star Trek, and she had a whole unit on becoming the Starship captain, the Starship Enterprise captain, by going through all these different exercises. And I was determined to be the first captain in my classroom of the Starship Enterprise. And so, even at that early age, I was very determined to sort of succeed in building technology for space. I was fascinated with the tricorder, the medical tricorder, with the transporter. And that passion continued through college. I started working I went to Swarthmore College, and I worked during the summer at Brandeis University at the Graybeal Spatial Orientation Lab, where they did research on humans in space by flying in a plane called the Vomit Comet. And so we would go up in this airplane and it would fly in parabolas. And at the top of the parabola, you have 20 seconds of zero gravity where you could do some research in zero gravity. But then you had to pull out, or so you didn't crash, you had to do double gravity to pull out of the parabola. And you did that over and over and over. So hence the Vomit Comet. But then that continued to graduate school, where I studied aerospace engineering and neuroscience, because biomedical engineering wasn't a degree then. You couldn't actually get a degree in biomedical engineering, but that's essentially what I was working on. And I worked very closely with the space program. My PhD thesis was actually a spaceflight experiment with astronauts. We would go down to Houston and support these research-based shuttle missions. So basically, I don't even know how to end that story, because I didn't become an astronaut. I did interview.
You did?
I did interview. I made it as a finalist, and I was not selected. They said my eyes were not good enough, and I had, and my knee wasn't strong enough. And now it is. Now I have a titanium knee. But
that sounds like another story.
That's another story, but too many sports injuries.
Yeah.
So, I continued my PhD work, and at that time, the field of biomedical engineering was emerging, which was super exciting. So when I graduated, from my graduate work at MIT, I became a professor of biomedical engineering, which I found hilarious, because none of us in biomedical engineering had degrees in biomedical engineering. So we were at the forefront, kind of like you with entrepreneurship, in academia.
Yeah.
It's like we didn't have degrees in, entrepreneurship or biomedical engineering. And so I was teaching at Catholic University in Washington, D.C., and I had an adjunct appointment over in aerospace engineering at University of Maryland. And one day I was over at University of Maryland, and I saw they were building this big building. And I said, well, what's going on over there? And they said, well, it's a business incubator. And I thought, well, what's that about? And they said, well, it's where people like professors or students can start companies to productize an idea they have. And it just so happened to be around the time I had the idea of doing this educational, rehab robot. And I thought, well, I'd like to do that. And so I kind of went over and got the application and took a leave of absence from academia, started the company, had to recruit business partner and colleagues and a team to start this company. And what was amazing is that I was able to take my funding with me, which was a very unique way to start a company. I had built, along with other faculty members, we had built a very large research center over at the National Rehabilitation Hospital. And people were starting to get very excited about this idea of technology transfer. And so I was able to take, as a principal investigator in this center, I was able to take my funding, instead of bringing it into the university, I could take it with me to start the company. So it was a very unique way, I think, of starting a company. I mean, you tell me, because I don't know of many entrepreneurs starting a company that way. And then the long story, just a little bit longer, I had so much fun, I never went back to academia. I continued to teach every once in a while and work with students my whole life. But developing products was, the best thing ever. And I became a serial entrepreneur within my own company.
Love it. I love it. And you're right. It is, I think, a unique way to get started. But interestingly, it parallels a lot my path as well. Yeah, I took a sabbatical and actually did the same thing at the university where I was when I was in Cincinnati, and started a company there. The funding piece was a little different, but I think that it's interesting, I think, that we're seeing more and more faculty commercializing their research and taking it from the bench to the marketplace, although probably not enough. And especially, I would say, for women, because I think more men are taking that path than women. And as you know, the majority of patents still tend to be held by men over women. So we're making some strides, but I think there's a lot of opportunity there. And I love your story, and I love how you got sort of bitten by the entrepreneurial bug. And it's always been a passion of mine to bring entrepreneurship education to people, to students outside of the business college, because I think there are a lot of opportunities coming from the sciences, from the arts, from other fields. So you became a serial entrepreneur. You built a team. You learned all of this about entrepreneurship, sort of going through the process. So talk to us a little about that. What were some of the challenges that you had along the way? Not just with technology, because we know technology is important, but also with identifying the market, creating value, pivoting or changing when you had to. What were some of the challenges that you had along the way with building your first company and your subsequent companies?
Wow. Well, I mean, we faced all the challenges. I'll talk about a few. So pivoting, that's a great one, because I think that's something that I've had to do with every product, with every company. There's always a need to pivot in some way. Sometimes the pivoting is very small, a particular capability that you thought you needed or wanted, and the cost is too high. Sometimes the pivoting is quite large. Like, for example, started with the story of Cosmobot. Well, bringing Cosmobot to market was just a non-starter. I mean, it would have been thousands of dollars per robot in the mid-90s, an educational robot, and it was just clearly a non-starter. So we really had to think about which part of the market could we serve. The children with disabilities that's a big market. I mean, when you talk about learning disabilities, when you talk about physical disabilities. And so we really had to narrow down what was the specific area that we could have an impact in, and our knowledge aligned with the market, aligned with the technology. And what we ended up doing was an alternative computer interface. So we developed with essentially what we had developed for controlling the robot was called Mission Control. And it was an innovative interface for the computer. So you just replaced the keyboard with Mission Control and allowed kids with physical and behavioral or learning disabilities to access the computer intuitively. And we thought, well, this is great. This will give so many more kids access to the computer. And so that was a big pivot, huge pivot. And then we said, well, let's just partner with the best educational software out there with our new physical interface. And we started going through all of the different software that was out there at the time. I don't even know if it still exists, but Reader Rabbit was a big one. There was all these really great software for kids. And what we discovered is that the software, the educational goals had been dumbed down to be able to use existing physical interfaces, like a mouse or a couple keys on a keyboard. And so we had this great accessible interface with just a lot of dumbed down software. And so we ended up pivoting again and becoming a software company. We developed educational software. We found a new team to help us develop the educational software. And so that was a whole other pivot. And we ended up coming to market. Then we spun out a company called AT Kid Systems, and we brought to market Cosmos Learning System, which was an alternative keyboard and educational software that met the national standards for early childhood education curriculum. And it was amazing. It was a really great product. It was on the market for about 5 years, and that's not an unusual lifespan for a tech product, but you'll appreciate, essentially, there were two big disruptions of Cosmos Learning System. The first was technology. The iPad came out, and nobody wanted to use desktop computers anymore. And some people were able to adapt their software to an iPad. For us, that didn't make sense because it was so reliant on our innovative interface, accessible interface. So in some ways, accessibility went backwards, even though iPads had touchscreens. And then the other was that, I mean, that was unexpected just in the sense, technology innovation is unexpected. But the other one came from a very bizarre source. Hearst Media, biggest media conglomerate, I don't know, maybe in the world, gave us a cease and desist order because of the name Cosmo. They said that it was infringing upon their IP to call our system Cosmo's learning system.
Really?
Yeah. So they were willing to shut down a little company that did software for kids with disabilities.
Wow. Wow. Because they had something that was trademarked, I guess, with Cosmo.
Yeah. I mean, we weren't big enough to fight it. So, I mean,
Yeah,
what can you do?
sure.
I mean, I don't know if they had a legitimate case, and maybe if we had been bigger, and, the disruption all kind of happened at the same time. So, in the end, it was sort of moot, but I just thought that was fascinating that lawyers have nothing better to do than.
Well, yeah. Well, wow, there's so much in there. What I find really interesting about that story, and I love that you shared so much about the challenges of technology and the lifespan.
Yeah.
And, we get excited as techno-optimists. We get excited about all the new things coming out, but at the same time, it renders what's existing obsolete pretty quickly. And so I think for entrepreneurs, there are probably a lot of lessons in there that we can talk about. I think one thing that's really interesting is that you stayed focused on the problem. And I think that is a strategy for how to make decisions about pivoting, because it's so easy, as we talked about, to get really excited about the possibilities. And I think entrepreneurs have that in common. We like the new, big, bright, shiny thing. We can see, we get excited about technology and we get excited about the possibilities of what we can create. But sometimes the market's giving us a different message. Sometimes the technology's changing. But if we stay focused on the problem like you did, then you eventually find your way there. But I know it took a lot longer than you expected, cost a lot more money, and wasn't at all what you thought it would be.
Exactly.
Yeah. But I think it's a great story. And I think for people out there who are listening and they're either entrepreneurs or they've got an idea of something, I think, to be able to remain flexible like that is very powerful. And would you call being an entrepreneur a learning journey? Is that part of what you love about it?
For sure. Yes. Oh, yes, absolutely. I don't know that you can be an entrepreneur if you aren't willing, if you aren't excited about a learning journey. I feel like those sort of go hand in hand, that being an entrepreneur is all about learning. I mean, even if you're the rare entrepreneur just in it for the money, I mean, I don't know if there is such a thing, but it's kind of your problem solving, regardless of how you're coming at it, whether you're focusing on the need or you're pushing a technology or you just want to make money. And I don't think you're successful if you only do one of those things, back to the Venn diagram. But I think whatever way you're coming at it from, you have to learn. I was staying focused on the problem, but I also knew that I knew that technology was going to be part of the solution. Maybe it wasn't the top end technology, that I had started with. And I knew that I had to be realistic about the market. So I had to learn a tremendous amount. So I think that's part of it. No matter which way you approach it, you have to be ready to learn and available to learn, or you're not going to be successful.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to think about it. You have to remain available to learn. And that can be hard sometimes because it's really easy to fall in love with your solution to the problem.
Yeah. And no one wants to kill their darlings.
Yeah, I think that's probably one of the hardest things that we all deal with. But I think if we always go back to the problem will lead the way in providing value to solve that problem. You mentioned entrepreneurs and money, and there's often a conflict between an entrepreneur and an investor. And I used to give a presentation and I played on that John Gray book about men and women. And it was that entrepreneurs are from Venus, investors are from Mars. And most entrepreneurs loved it. Investors didn't always want to get it. But did you ever find yourself in conflict with the money? Because investors are they are investors and entrepreneurs, I think, are often using the same words, and they think they have the same agenda, and their agenda is definitely linked and interrelated and interdependent. But I think entrepreneurs, as you pointed out, are often proving a theory or a hypothesis, and investors are, understandably so, looking for a return. Did that ever, rear its ugly head in your journey?
Oh, yes. And in fact, quite recently, after selling my company, spent a year helping a young entrepreneur leading her company. And I think it's a real issue that a lot of investors have not been through the entrepreneurial path themselves, or maybe have had a very narrow path. There's very few investors who have been serial entrepreneurs themselves or have really felt it from the trenches. And I think that's a problem because I think they underestimate the risk, and they underestimate the risk, and they expect, there's like this, and this has happened through the past, 25 years or so of my career. I really have a problem with this. Let's do financial projections that are completely unrealistic. And everyone knows they're unrealistic, but investors want to be able to say they're backing, the billion-dollar company. I still find it very perplexing. I was lucky in my career to have been able to avoid those type of investors. I had some angel investors early on, and then funded through government contracts and corporate contracts. And we were able to self-fund as a company a lot of our innovation. But working with young entrepreneurs more recently, it feels like it hasn't changed. And these investors are incredibly unrealistic about both the risk and the return. I think it's a real problem.
Yeah, I think it's challenging. Many years ago, when I was in the northern Kentucky area, Kentucky decided to invest money into creating a network of angel investors and venture capitalists and doing training and preparation. It had some level of success, but I think again, it's a real challenge because they're often speaking a different language, like I talked about earlier.
Yeah.
And, I've seen it here in the Tampa Bay area where I live as well, because we have a lot of investors. You can have a lot of times money comes from a different source than an entrepreneurial venture. For example, in Tampa Bay, real estate, and investing in real estate is very different from investing in an entrepreneurial venture, as you just pointed out. So some of the challenges and the risks, I think it's a real challenge. And you probably had some grants that helped you along the way. And that was also my case, which can be really helpful. As so you are a serial entrepreneur still out there building things. What are you working on now? I know you're on a couple of boards because that's how we met. And like you, I'm guessing that you, like I, get a lot of questions about board work and how that works and how to get on boards and that sort of thing. But you've got board work. You're doing speaking now, right? You've sort of created that, and you've written your book about techno-optimism. And so what are you working on now? Is AI playing a part in, of course, AI has been around for a long time, but the new generation of AI that we're all more familiar with now, is AI a part of that? What are you doing exciting now that you could share with our audience?
So yes, AI is part of everything that everyone is doing and has been for a long time, as you have pointed out, but we haven't put a name on it. And so now it's very exciting because we finally get to name it and talk about what it can and cannot do. So this past year, I've been working with a young founder, Sydney Collin, and a young biomedical engineer. She was just named one of Forbes 30 under 30. A super smart engineer from Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. And she brought me on as CEO to work with her on the next generation of her product that she invented, NextStride. And NextStride is a super cool device. It attaches to any walker or cane, and it stabilizes gait and prevent falls, but not through physical stabilization, through neurotech. It's a neurotechnology. It uses visual and auditory cues to change the neural pathway in your brain that controls walking. And it actually stabilizes gait and prevents falls. And she brilliantly used 2 decades of research and literature that physical therapists have leveraged in a physical therapist's office, but it had not been portable. And so she designed this device, and we have been brainstorming about how AI and how data enabled technology could go into this device. And so I think what would be exciting is to keep an eye out over these next few years for devices that have data collection capabilities that are going to prevent falls in the elderly, which is a serious problem that not only costs, millions of dollars, but it also, the CDC estimates that someone falls every second, and it results in 40,000 deaths per year. So it's a big problem in our elderly and our loved ones. And I think that's going to be a market that many of us are going to be interested in, both for our own loved ones and companies that are very interested in helping people stay at home longer, live independently longer. So that's a super exciting field, and to keep an eye out for how AI can really help people live independently longer.
I love that. I love that. And I'm very interested in that too, because as I get older, every time I go to the doctor, they say, have you had a fall in the last year? I don't know when they start that, but I know at some point it does become, it does become an issue. That's a great product. And so it sounds like you're continuing to work with companies, serve on boards, do your own public speaking, write books.
Yeah. So on top of that, so that project just wrapped up. So I'm on 2 public boards, both tech companies. One of them is a large public company, PTC, which has CAD, computer-aided design software, project lifecycle management software, application lifecycle management software. So as more and more products become more software focused, if you think of a car, even a car has a tremendous amount of software in it and is going to incorporate more and more AI. So this whole idea of product and application lifecycle management as we do product design, whether we're a small little company developing one product or a huge company that has thousands of products, it's so important, especially with the escalation in AI and software development, to be able to keep track of that. Companies like PTC, including PTC, are the ones that are writing software to help you track your requirements and your software to fulfill those requirements.
Yeah.
And then the other company that I'm on the board of, which is also a very exciting company, but at the other extreme, it's a small public company, Exobionics. We make wearable exoskeletons for people who have experienced stroke, quadriplegia, multiple sclerosis. And the idea is that in the clinic, they use these fairly large exoskeletons to help them retrain their bodies and brains to walk again. And we were just approved by the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare for reimbursement for a home system. So people who are qualified can actually take a version of this exoskeleton home, and instead of using a wheelchair, can actually walk. And that is so important. They'll probably use a wheelchair a good part of the time, but they can go out with friends and walk. They can go to the mall. They can go to, their child's wedding. They can, there's beautiful stories out there of people who are able to use these devices, and it keeps them healthier longer to be able to get up and actually use your own body to walk.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. And I love that you have found a way to keep giving back and supporting and mentoring other entrepreneurs, in this space where you have so much expertise and experience. Have you also had mentors along the way that have helped you? And maybe did you have advisory boards or boards of directors? And do you have any advice for our listeners about that, about finding the right people to help them along the way?
Yeah, I have maybe a little bit different view of who a mentor is. I learn so much from everyone around me. I think if you're not learning from someone and they're not learning from you, then maybe that's not, maybe that's not the relationship you need. I mean, I use the young entrepreneur that I worked with this past year. I've learned so much from her. I mean, I don't know what it's like to be under 30 and an entrepreneur anymore. And to learn about how, you manage a team, a distributed team. I mean, the Gen Zers, they're all distributed. They work seamlessly through Zoom. And look, I'm on boards with people who are, in their 50s, 60s, 70s, and they don't know how to have a Zoom conversation. But the 20 somethings do, because they've grown up with it and they know how to listen to each other and how to include everyone in the conversation. They know how to have, all last year, they would have water cooler moments, but on Zoom. So scheduled times where you could just get on Zoom and chill out with your colleagues, so that every meeting didn't have a lot of chit chat and, all that stuff that we feel as older people that we need to get out of the way before we start any meeting.
Right, right.
They actually had scheduled times to do that.
I love it.
It was so brilliant. But to your question about mentors, yes, I've had mentors all along the way, and sometimes they're peers, sometimes they're colleagues, sometimes they're advisors that I've asked if they could help advise me, and sometimes they're employees or friends. So I think that it's definitely important to have a network of people that you can go to and reach out to, depending on what questions you have.
But I also heard you say that you can learn everywhere if you're watching and paying attention. So I think that's great advice. Build that network, have those trusted people, but don't look at learning and personally growing as something that you only do with a few people. Sometimes we learn what not to do from other people too.
Right. Exactly.
I think that's great advice. So you kindly mentioned my book earlier, and most of my podcasts, I try to dig into those competencies of a mindset. And we've talked about how you developed your opportunity and how you some of the things that you did building your company. We could certainly talk all day, probably, and all day tomorrow and all week about the lessons that you've learned. But one of the things I always love to talk about, and I think people want to hear, is, how did you along the way have any failures? And how do you process failure and how do you deal with that as an entrepreneur?
Yeah. I mean, the failure question is a tough one, because I'm sure I've had a million failures. I've definitely had a million failures, but I never even process them as failures. I mean, they're just obstacles. They're just problems to solve. They're just design iterations. I mean, I have never called anything a failure in my life. I mean, I'm not even sure what a failure would look like, because it's just life. I mean, life is filled with obstacles and problems to solve. And, So I guess the short answer is yes, I've had failures, and no, I've had failures. I haven't had any failures, but lots and lots of obstacles and problems to solve.
No, I think, I think that's a great way to look at it, because what I think you're saying is that failure is when something doesn't work out the way you expected it, which is one way to define a failure, and probably the way to define it. But the solution is you have agency, you have capability to find a different path.
Yes. And I think that's always been my expectation as a problem solver. I mean, in some ways, maybe it's not I'm an optimist. So I guess it's when something doesn't work out, I'm thinking, well, yes, what is my agency in turning this around to make it work? Because I think it can. So yes, absolutely. I love that you said we have agency, because that's exactly right. And that's a key theme of my book, and Techno-Optimism. It's that we all have agency in shaping the future. We all have agency in how these technologies are used. even if it's speaking up on how we think they should be used if we're not a technologist ourselves. So I think that agency, knowing that we have agency, is a key theme in your book and in mine.
Yeah. And I think, optimism as well, because I have a whole chapter on that. And really, I think if entrepreneurs aren't optimists, then why do all the stuff we do, right? Because if you don't believe that you can positively impact the future. And but yes, absolutely. Well, I have loved this conversation. I feel like we could talk on, like I said, for several days. I think we'll have to revisit this again because we could have a whole other podcast talking about board work or being a book author or any of the other things that I think we're all working on. I love that you're maybe that you have had a / career, entrepreneur / educator / academic scientist / book author and so on and so on. I think it makes life interesting and fun. And you're certainly a great example of that. Before I let you go, though, I have one last question. I always ask all my guests if they had one piece of advice for the entrepreneur out there that's maybe early in this career or trying to figure out their own entrepreneurial journey, maybe something you would have liked to have known. What would that one piece of advice be?
Well, I absolutely would say do cool things with cool people and you won't go wrong. And the inverse of that is to have a no asshole policy. Can we say that on the podcast?
Absolutely. I have had that for a long time. I've always called it a no butthead. So it's just, it's the same thing. Okay. I learned that from my very first departmental chair. He said, that he had a no butthead rule, and I have adopted that through my life. So I think it makes a lot of sense. And what I hear is that the people that you spend a lot of time with make a big difference in your journey. So that's a great advice, I think. Well, Cori, this has been fantastic. Where can our guests find out more about you and your work? If they'd like to have you come and speak or if they'd like to buy your book, where do they find all that?
Easiest is CoriLathan.com or also inventthefuture.tech. Either of those go to the same place, and you'll have links to my LinkedIn, to my speaker sizzle reel, my book, all of that. CoriLathan.com.
Thank you, Cori. This has been amazing. I appreciate you joining me today on The In Factor.
Thank you so much, Rebecca.
I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Dr. Cori Lathan. Her journey from the early days of emerging tech to today's boardroom is a powerful reminder of how vision and persistence shape real innovation. If this episode resonated with you, please follow the In Factor, share it with a friend, and leave a quick review. It helps us keep bringing you conversations that matter. Thanks for listening, and as always, keep building boldly and with heart.